The lavender soap appeared on my doorstep one Thursday morning, wrapped in brown paper and tied with the exact same cream-colored ribbon my husband used 30 years ago. I stood there holding it. David had always chosen lavender soap. I hadn't seen a bar like this since the year he died. There was no note, no name, just the soap and that ribbon, soft as a whisper. I'd been alone in this apartment for 6 years. The woman next door had moved in 3 months ago. I'd seen her twice, once in the hallway, once at the mailboxes. She was older than me, maybe 65, with deep brown skin and silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. Her name was Rhonda. I knew because I'd seen it on her mailbox. I brought the soap inside and set it on the bathroom counter. That evening, I unwrapped it carefully. The scent filled the small room, gentle and insistent, and I closed my eyes. For a moment, I was back in our old house, standing in the doorway while David hummed in the shower, steam curling around the frosted glass. I hadn't let myself remember things like that in a long time. If these stories touch you, please like and subscribe. A week later, there was a small jar on my doorstep. Homemade strawberry preserves. The label was handwritten in careful cursive. No name again, but the jar was tied with that same cream ribbon. I opened it that afternoon and spread it on toast. The taste was so familiar it made my chest ache. I set the jar down and stared at it for a long time. My hands were shaking, but even then, something about these small gifts felt quietly unfinished. I thought about knocking on Rhonda's door, but something held me back. The quiet understanding that some kindness works best when it stays unnamed. 2 weeks after that, I found a small bundle of dried herbs on my mat. Rosemary and thyme, tied together with, yes, cream-colored ribbon. I brought them inside and hung them by the kitchen window. The scent filled the room, and I felt something I hadn't felt in years. I felt seen, but I still didn't knock on her door. One morning in early October, I found a folded recipe card tucked under my door. It was old, the edges soft and worn. The handwriting was faded but legible. Blackberry cobbler. And underneath, in smaller letters, a note about finding sweetness on difficult days. I turned it over. On the back, in pencil, was a date, July 14th, 1991. I didn't know that date would open a door I wasn't ready for, but the date on the recipe card made my breath catch in a way I couldn't explain. July 14th, 1991. That was the summer David and I had driven to his mother's house in Virginia. We'd spent a week there, and she'd taught me how to make cobbler in her tiny kitchen while David sat on the porch reading. I remembered the smell of the berries, the way the crust turned golden, the way his mother had smiled when I got it right. But I'd never written the recipe down, and David's mother had passed away 2 years later. So how did Rhonda have it? The handwriting wasn't mine. It wasn't David's mother's either, but the details were exact, the measurements, the little note at the bottom. I looked at the wall I shared with Rhonda's apartment. For the first time in months, I felt something other than emptiness. I felt curious. That evening, I finally knocked. She answered after a long pause. She wore a cardigan the color of rust and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. Something in her eyes flickered. Recognition, maybe, or relief. I thanked her for the recipe card, for the soap, for all the quiet kindnesses. She nodded slowly and spoke my name, even though I'd never told her what it was. She stepped back and gestured for me to come in. Her apartment was the mirror image of mine, but it felt warmer somehow. She offered me tea, and I accepted. We sat across from each other in her living room, and for a while, neither of us spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence two people share when they both know something is about to shift. Finally, she told me she'd known my husband. The words landed gently, but they changed everything. I asked her how, and she explained that it had been a long time ago before David and I had met. She'd worked at a community center in Richmond in the 80s. David had volunteered there on weekends, helping kids with homework, fixing broken things, making people laugh. She described the kind of kindness he'd had, the sort that never asked for anything in return. I felt my throat tighten. That was David. Exactly. They'd been friends, she told me. Not close, but steady. He'd talked about me sometimes, about the life we were building together, about how much he loved me. She paused, her hands folded in her lap. Then she told me something I'd forgotten. David used to say I made him believe in small miracles. That's what he'd called me all those years ago. I hadn't heard that phrase in 30 years, but I remembered it. He used to say it when I'd surprise him with his favorite dinner, or when I'd find his reading glasses before he even knew they were lost. Rhonda explained that she'd moved away when her mother became ill. She'd had to return to Alabama, and over time she and David had lost touch. She hadn't known he'd passed until she moved into this building and saw my name on the mailbox. She'd looked me up, read the obituary, and realized I was still here, still alone. I didn't know what to say. She told me she hadn't been sure whether to introduce herself. She hadn't wanted to intrude on my grief, but she'd thought maybe she could leave small reminders that someone was thinking of me, that I wasn't as alone as I felt. I looked down at the tea in my hands, the steam curling up between us. I asked her about the soap, about the ribbon, about how she'd known. She smiled just a little and explained that David had mentioned it once. He told her how I loved the way he wrapped things, how even the smallest gift felt special because of it. And the lavender, he described his grandmother's garden, how we'd sit on her porch in the evenings and smell it on the breeze. I felt something crack open inside me, something that had been sealed shut for years. I whispered her name and asked why she hadn't just knocked on my door. She looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the weight she carried, the same weight I carried. She told me that some grief doesn't want company. It just wants to know it's not forgotten. We sat together until the tea went cold. Over the next few weeks, we began to share more than silence. She told me about her own losses, a daughter who'd moved across the country and stopped calling, a husband who'd left when the weight became too much. She told me about the years she'd spent trying to be invisible, trying not to take up too much space in a world that didn't always make room for her. And I told her about David, about the mornings I still set 2 cups out by mistake, about the closet full of his clothes I couldn't bring myself to touch, about the way I'd stopped cooking because it reminded me of all the meals we'd shared. She listened without trying to fix anything, and that made all the difference. We started a routine. Tuesday evenings, we'd have tea in her apartment. Thursday mornings, she'd knock on my door and we'd walk to the corner bakery together. Small things, steady things. One afternoon in late November, I knocked on her door and found it unlocked. I called her name. No answer. I stepped inside. She was on the sofa, her face pale, her breathing shallow. They took her to the hospital, and I followed. And on the 3rd day, she asked me to bring her something else. She told me there was a box in her closet on the top shelf and asked if I could bring it to her. I did. What I found inside her apartment wasn't what I expected. It was something that had been waiting for decades. The box was plain, cardboard tied with string. I brought it to the hospital, and she opened it slowly, her hands trembling. Inside were letters, dozens of them, and photographs. I recognized David's handwriting immediately. She explained that he'd written to her after she moved, just a few times a year, postcards mostly, updates about his life, little stories. He'd wanted her to know he was happy. I looked through them, my heart pounding. There were pictures, too. David at the community center. David laughing with a group of kids. David holding a toolbox, grinning at the camera. One postcard showed a beach at sunset. On the back, David had written about our anniversary trip, about how I'd collected shells for hours while he'd collected reasons to love me. And then I found one that made me stop breathing. The photograph in her drawer showed a moment I thought only 2 people had ever known. It was David and me, standing in his mother's kitchen. I was holding a bowl of blackberries, and he had his arm around my waist, his face lit up with that smile I'd fallen in love with. Someone had taken the photo through the screen door, and we hadn't even noticed. Rhonda told me he'd sent her that one with a note describing what happiness looked like. I pressed my hand to my mouth, trying to hold everything in. She explained that she'd kept them all because even after he was gone, she'd wanted to remember that kindness like his existed. And when she'd moved into this building and realized I was there, she'd thought maybe she could give some of that back to me. In small ways, quiet ways. There was another photograph beneath that one. It showed Rhonda and David standing outside the community center, both of them younger, both of them smiling. David had his hand on her shoulder in that easy, brotherly way he had with people he cared about. She told me David had been a good man and that he'd loved me more than anything. She'd wanted me to remember that. Not the grief, not the loss, just the love. I didn't realize until then that some people protect you long before you even know you need it. I stayed with her until she was strong enough to go home, and when we walked back into the building together, I didn't go to my apartment. I went to hers. We made tea. We sat by the window, and I realized that for the first time in 6 years, I didn't feel alone. The last gift Rhonda ever left on my doorstep wasn't wrapped in ribbon. It was a single lavender sprig tucked into an envelope with my name on it. Inside was a note in her careful handwriting about how some bonds don't need words. They just need someone willing to notice. And every morning when the light comes through, I think about how grief can make us invisible. But love, even the quietest kind, can always find us. I knock on Rhonda's door now. Most days, she knocks on mine first, and I've started cooking again. Last week, I made blackberry cobbler from that recipe card. Rhonda came over, and we ate it warm with vanilla ice cream, the way David used to like it. She didn't say much. She didn't have to. Some friendships are built on big moments. Ours was built on lavender soap and strawberry preserves, and the understanding that sometimes the most profound connections come from the smallest acts of noticing. David would have loved her. I think somehow he knew I'd need her. If you could leave one small kindness for someone who's hurting, what would it be?